Okay, good afternoon Year 12 psychologists. Welcome to this next kind of supported video looking at depression. So far you would have, according to the work that's set, done your kind of pre-reading, and you would have looked at the information in the booklet, kind of given the background information around the cognitive approach to explaining depression. So if you haven't done that, do pause the video and go back and make sure you've done that pre-reading before we do this video. So this is kind of a supported video looking at the key elements of the cognitive approach to explaining depression. You're doing a really good job, everybody, so well done. And just a bit of housekeeping as well before we get started. Reminder that this Friday we'll be starting our first kind of Q&A and tutorial sessions, which will happen every Friday. So do have a look at the details of that on the Teams chat. Okay, so in terms of what we need to be able to cover and understand for this part of the course, we need to be able to describe the behavioural, emotional and cognitive characteristics of depression, which is what you did last week. It'd be good to discuss that as well this week in our tutorial on Friday. We need to use the cognitive approach, specifically Beck's and Ellis's theories, to explain depression, and then we're going to evaluate that. And we'll be evaluating the kind of validity of these explanations next week. Okay, so in terms of the cognitive approach, we have studied the cognitive approach before, okay, when we looked at memory. What can you remember about the following key terms? And I want you just to cast your mind back to the beginning of Year 12, and think about the fundamental ideas of the cognitive approach. So we've got a couple of key terms to think about. Schemas, this idea of a computer model, and rational versus irrational thinking. So I want you just to pause the video and just try to remember what are your first kind of thoughts when you think about these key terms in terms of the cognitive approach. So pause the video, have a think. So of course, the main kind of assumption of the cognitive approach is that it's all about information processing. Cognitive and cognition refers to thought processes. And a lot of cognitive psychologists use this idea of a computer model, this idea of filtering and processing information, that our mind, we use this sort of analogy or metaphor that the mind is a computer, and that we, according to cognitive psychologists, that we process information and there's an output. We'll be looking, kind of taking that a little bit further into this idea of depression and explaining it from this kind of perspective of thought processes. What are the thought processes behind the mood disorder that is depression? Schemas. Schemas refer to this idea of kind of a packet of information, if you like, kind of preconceived ideas based on your own experience. We have a schema for lots of different things. So a good example to use it, if you think about your schema for a thief or a robber, you'd often think of someone in dark clothing, with a swag bag maybe. You might go down the stereotypical route. And these schemas act as kind of cognitive shortcuts to allow us to process information rapidly. We build up these schemas throughout our life based on our experiences and our how we interact with the world, and by having these schemas, it allows these cognitive shortcuts to allow us to interact with the world much more efficiently and effectively. Rational versus irrational thinking, we've obviously looked at that when we looked at phobias, and we'll see that actually with depression there can be a lot of irrational thinking rather than rational. Okay, so I just wanted to pause the video and consider these two questions before we get into the theory. How might this approach explain the onset of depression? How might schemas, information processing, irrational thinking, how could you tie those key terms to depression, having looked at the kind of key aspects of and characteristics of depression? Secondly, how would this differ to the behavioural approach? So just pause the video and I just want you to consider these two questions. Okay, with the first question, we'll be looking at the key theories behind, in terms of Beck's and Ellis, and we'll get into that as we go through this PowerPoint. With that second question, of course, the difference with the behavioural approach is that we would suggest that the behaviour is learnt. Okay? And so here, there's a key difference between the behavioural approach and the cognitive approach. Cognitive approach is all about our information processing, the schemes that we have built up over time, whereas the behavioural approach would say that depression is a learned behaviour. Okay, so very, very different. So it's important that we distinguish between these approaches, and we're going to focus specifically on the cognitive approach for this. So as we said, schemas are mental representations that we hold about the experiences and objects we have had in our lives and we've experienced. This helps us to organise information and to interpret new information as well. Like I said, we have these schemas that we've built up over time, and it helps us to interact with our world efficiently and effectively. Sometimes these schemas may hinder or negatively affect our behaviour, and this is how we can start to think about applying schema theory to depression. So I want you to have a look at this table below. Complete the table below. For each experience, give an example of a positive and negative schema that relates to this. The first one has been done for you. So failing a test, our kind of positive schema would be I will revise harder next time. Our negative schema might be I'll never pass A-levels. I am useless. It's a bit extreme there. So I wanted to pause the video and see if you can think about how could a negative schema, a positive schema versus a negative schema, how could a negative schema enable you to explain these various situations that is occurring in someone's life? So if we have these kind of positive schemas, we might interpret the second one as my friend was busy, they'll text me later. If we hold a very negative schema around these sorts of things, then we may interpret this event very negatively. We may say something like, our friend doesn't like us, for example. Okay, so we can have positive, and this is we're talking very, very generally here. You can have positive schemas and negative schemas that, in a way, we interpret our world through them. It's almost like putting on a pair of goggles. Okay, you can have a positive schema, got a set of goggles, negative schema set of goggles, and we kind of interpret our world through these schemas. Okay? So this is kind of more general, and we'll start to apply it to specific theory in there. Now, another key aspect of the cognitive approach, cognitive theory, is cognitive biases or cognitive errors. And of course, we have lots of cognitive biases, lots and lots and lots. And it's a really, really interesting area of psychology, actually, how we hold a particular bias, whether it's an attribution bias or a gender bias. We have these biases that we build up through our own experience, and it's something that teachers are looking at a lot at the minute, particularly in our school, around kind of how we have these biases in various ways. So we have these all the time, and often they're quite hard to stop. Okay, so a bias is types of thoughts that are not reflective of the actual situation. Okay, not reflective of the true situation. They develop often from a negative schema or schemata, that's plural for schema, and can affect your emotions and behaviour. And a cognitive bias can have then a specific error. Okay, so for example, if you fail to get a job you interview for, you decide you are never going to get a job, or you might go on to go on one unsuccessful date that is, you decide you are never going to find a partner, for example. This could be referred to as an overgeneralization. Something negative has happened, and then you generalize that to lots of other aspects of your life. So the schema, the negative schema, can lead to, so having a general negative schema can lead to having specific cognitive errors. This example is what we call overgeneralization cognitive error, and you can see how that's been applied to different aspects of this person's world. So another example, you send out the wrong letter to a client at work, and this turns into, okay, I'll now lose my job, and then I won't be able to pay my bills, and then I'll lose my house. So quite extremely. So something negative has happened, and because this person holds some negative schemas, they've interpreted the world negatively, and they've gone quite extreme here, and we call this kind of effect catastrophizing. Okay, it's gone beyond. It's turned into a catastrophe. It's turned quite extreme, the interpretation of that event. Another example: during the day, you get stuck in traffic and are late for work. You also receive praise for a piece of work you have previously done. When you reflect on the day, you can only focus on being late for work. And often people that suffer from depression, despite the positive things that are happening in their life, they often just remember the negative things and really focus on those negative aspects in their life. And this is what we call selective abstraction, which is basically selecting for and paying attention to the negative aspects in that person's life, regardless of how many positive things have happened that day or that week. So what we've got here then is how someone suffering with depression who has negative schemas, various things, can lead to this affecting how they interpret the world, which then leads to this type of cognitive error. And you'll see that in Beck's triad, which you've been reading about. So here we go, nicely done. Into Beck's triad then. So we can kind of bring this all together into the triad, and that the person that is suffering with depression has a negative view of themselves, a negative view of the world, and therefore a negative view on the future. And this can be a bit of a bad cycle that someone can find themselves in. So the negative schema can lead to negative biases and maintain a negative triad in this kind of irrational and pessimistic belief system. Beck believed that depressed individuals feel as they do as they have negative interpretations and lack a perceived sense of control. And we've mentioned this idea of a lack of control before, which is very typical of someone suffering with depression. Typically, those people with an external locus of control, i.e. those that feel that the world and kind of fate is controlling their life, are more likely to be suffer with depression, rather than someone who has an internal locus of control, who feels that they can control their kind of what they're doing in their everyday life and their successes and things like that. So we often see this lack of sense of control. It can be really, really prevalent in someone with depression. But this all ties into the Beck's negative triad: negative view on the self, negative view on the world, and negative view for the future. On to Ellis's ABC model then. Slightly different, still bringing in this idea of kind of negative emotions, still bringing the idea of some kind of irrational belief system, and also responding to an event. But it's more of a kind of step-by-step process and slightly more simplified. So often, on a day-to-day basis, we will experience these negative events, and someone who's not suffering with depression will have a rational belief. Okay, so let's say a friend doesn't text you back, whatever it is. A rational belief would be, okay, so it's more likely they're busy, and there'll be a healthy negative emotion, and they'll be able to deal with that. Someone who's suffering with depression, when a negative event happens, the A in this model, they'll lead to an irrational belief that the friend doesn't like them anymore, that they're never going to speak to them again, similar to the kind of the generalizations and catastrophizing biases that were mentioned earlier, which will then lead to an unhealthy negative emotion, kind of extreme sadness or feelings of worthlessness. So Ellis calls this the activating event. Okay, and we've got another example here. So you might be really unfortunate and be mugged, for example. The rational belief would be, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the consequence of the healthy emotion was you feel disappointed. Okay, you feel upset, you feel disappointed, and that's upsetting. But you're able to deal with that. Somebody who's suffering with depression, if they're to be mugged, their irrational belief was, I am useless, it's my fault that I got mugged. And again, this kind of ties into the external locus of control idea as well. As a consequence then, you have an unhealthy emotion and you might be angry at yourself. So the ABC, in terms of the ABC model, refers to A, the activating event, B, the belief that's in place, whether that's rational or irrational for a depressed person, and then the consequence, what is the consequence of that belief, and how does that affect the mood, as is depression being a mood disorder. What I'd like you to do now is to kind of complete your own example. Okay, and of course you can pause the video now and go back through sections of the video if you want to then add to your notes in your booklet, or add kind of further additions and kind of annotations to the notes that you've made already. So have a go at completing your own example of the ABC model. You could use the following events: your best friend ignores you in the corridor, you've got low marks on the maths test, failing your driving test, any of those, or a different example of your own, and try and use this model to explain what would happen for a depressed person versus a non-depressed person. So have a go and just pause the video and have a think about that task. Okay, now we are going to look at the evaluation next week, but I thought I would just sort of pop these up in term and give you something to think about, ready for next week, because we will be evaluating this theory. So there are various strengths and weaknesses around this cognitive theory. You might want to pause the video now and kind of just think, where could there be some practical applications? Who is blamed for the disorder? Are there any issues with cause and effect? Are there other potential causes for these irrational behaviours and thus depression? Is a rational response ever suitable? Is it justified? Can an irrational response be justified? So this is kind of stimulus for you guys to have a think about in terms of evaluating the theory, and you can have a think about that for next week. Okay, so this is kind of a slimmed down version of what you've got in your booklet and the readings that you've done. I just wanted to pick up on some of the key elements, okay, of the cognitive theory. Look forward to speaking to you guys on Friday, and we'll discuss this a bit further. I'll ask you a few questions. Maybe we can discuss the evaluation ready for next week as well. And I'll see you on Friday on Teams. Okay, thanks very much.